From London to Washington to Moscow, Eurosceptics are flexing their political muscles. Tonight, Europe's first line of defense, re-electing Donald Tusk, president of the European Council. Unanimous support for the Polish politician, except from Poland. I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
We need to push in the same direction, all together in favor of European citizens.
There can be no agreement on the appointment of a new head of the European Council, whoever it may be, if that person doesn't have the consent of their home country.
I invest a lot of energy to find a compromise. So we try to find a way how to reconcile the positions, but we were not successful.
Germany will be supporting the re-election of Tusk. That is, the continuation of his presidency.
One country or a number of countries might be against that decision, but one country cannot block a decision. There are very clear rules of engagement and rules of procedure which we will follow.
Also on the day, there must be something in that alpine air. Switzerland. Yes, Switzerland is now the best country in the world. We'll tell you why and who says so later in the show. We begin the day with saving Europe with a Polish paradox. Today, European leaders voted almost unanimously to re-elect Donald Tusk, president of the European Council. It was an obvious decision to not rock the boat in the wake of Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump. Now, Mr. Tusk is from Poland, and his home country was the one vote against him today. The conservative Polish government claims Mr. Tusk has used his European position to meddle in domestic politics. Well, so much for a unified front against a growing legion of leaders who wouldn't mind seeing the European Union become a part of history. In a moment, I'll ask one of the EU's most vocal supporters how much is too much to keep everyone under the same European roof. Our coverage begins tonight with this report.
This is the first time that the 28 heads of state have set foot inside the EU's new €300 million headquarters. As well as futuristic architecture, the leaders have a packed agenda awaiting them: the single market, migration, security and defense. But there might be some fallout over the re-election of EU Council President Donald Tusk. The Polish Prime Minister has threatened to sabotage the summit if Tusk is elected against Warsaw's will. It can't go ahead without us, not without our support. I think it's worth remembering that this principle forms our community. On Wednesday, Szydlo's Law and Justice Party even posted a YouTube video that sought to stir up opposition to the EU Council president. Former Premier Tusk is unpopular because of his criticism of Poland's domestic policies. But Warsaw was in an isolated position. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and other EU leaders came out in support of Tusk. Because of continuity and stability, I think there is no doubt about re-electing Donald Tusk as president of the European Council. And I don't see why one country would be against him if all other countries support him. A qualified majority would have been enough, but Donald Tusk was re-elected with 27-1 vote. Poland's defeat is seen as an embarrassment for the country's foreign policy. But so far it's unclear if Poland will make good on its threats and retaliate.
Joining me now from Brussels is Philippe Lambert. He is the co-leader of the Green Party European Free Alliance in the European Parliament. Good evening to you, Mr. Lambert. Were you in support of Belgium's voting for Mr. Tusk today?
Well, my government supported Mr. Tusk. To be honest, as an opposition MEP in the European Parliament, I've never been very much impressed by the leadership qualities of Donald Tusk. but actually it's Poland that ensured that no one would ask any question, because no one around the table wanted to give that present to Mr. Kaczynski. And that is, he ensured that no doubt would be expressed about the personal qualities of Donald Tusk. But let's face it, I didn't see a lot of leadership after Brexit. I'm not sure that Mr. Tusk really understands why a growing number of Europeans are turning their back on the European project, and that is what should really worry him.
Well, what you're speaking to there is a lack of leadership in Europe, which we hear a lot these days. And it's also an argument that you hear from the Eurosceptics.
I agree. But of course, the Eurosceptics want to get rid of the European integration project, whereas we Greens are strong supporters of that project. And again, it is about sovereignty. I agree. That's the one piece of thing I would agree with the Eurosceptics. It's really about sovereignty, and sovereignty means the ability of peoples to get a handle on their future. And actually, if you look at the threats surrounding Europe, if you look at Putin in the East, if you look at Trump in the West, if you look at the power, the corporate power, if you look at climate change, it's quite obvious that even the largest countries in Europe do not have the leverage that they need to act successfully. And this is why we need to work together at European level. So like it or not, we need to act together. Now, in order to be efficient and effective, well, we need leadership. And what I've seen from Tusk, but I must confess also from Juncker, is rather a lack of leadership and actually a lack of understanding of why people are turning their backs on Europe, why they shouldn't.
Well, Mr.
And to me, the real question... Yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. Well, who, in your opinion, then would be a good leader? Earlier this month, you told the European Commission that Europe needs a radical change in direction. Who could provide that?
Well, I wonder whether anyone sitting around the table of the European Council has the vision. Actually, it's not rocket science. Look at the rising inequalities. Look at the number of Europeans that feel left behind or who feel that they might be the next ones to be left behind. We shouldn't look much further to understand why an increasing number of Europeans are doubtful about the European integration. I'd like to see the likes of Mr. Juncker and Mr. Tusk understanding that actually Europe can only be successful if it is a project of shared prosperity. And the shared is really important here. It cannot be just a prosperity of the happy few. And that is a problem. For 30 years after the start of the Rome Treaty, we could see a reduction of inequality across Europe. Now, for 30 years, we've seen an increase of inequality. Well, people start understanding that the policies, and not the institutions, but the policies that are being carried out, favor the happy few, and that is a problem.
Well, what would you say about your own country, Mr. Lambert? I mean, your country almost torpedoed the free trade agreement with Canada last year. I mean, that is certainly not an example of showing leadership or working in unity, is it?
Well, it is leadership from a small region in Belgium. But again, the heart of the question is it not so that such, well, neoliberal-inspired trade treaties are actually favoring rising inequalities? And this is the reason, the main argument why we Greens, as strong pro-Europeans, have opposed this treaty, because this treaty is precisely one of those instruments that make corporate power ever more powerful, and this is why we oppose it. Again, there's a difference being anti one sort of free trade treaties, and there's various sorts of them, and being against Europe. And I know that, of course, the Eurosceptics are also against these treaties, but not for the same reason as ours.
Mr. Lambert, let me ask you about another development today. The founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, says that he will give CIA hacking secrets to tech companies to help them protect the gadgets that they make for consumers. Are you in favor of that? Do you trust Mr. Assange to make good decisions for the welfare of European citizens?
No, personally, I'm wary of massive powers being vested with individuals, yet, let's face it, what we see is an increasing surveillance state, not just in the US, because let's be honest, if you look at the British secret services and the French secret services, and I would dare say others in Europe, they are also they have embarked into massive surveillance exercises, and this is what we should counter. Now, I would much prefer that these things being put in the open, not just for the tech companies, but for everyone to be able to judge. I do believe in the power of sharing knowledge rather than keeping it private.
Yeah, you speak of being open. Today, Nigel Farage was seen leaving the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Mr. Assange has lived now for about 4 years. Mr. Farage, of course, being one of the lead Brexiteers. Now, he was asked what he was doing there, and he said
Yes.
he couldn't remember. Are you concerned that the forces against the European Union are working together with WikiLeaks and possibly even Russia to destabilize or maybe even destroy the EU?
Well, it's quite obvious that WikiLeaks has enjoyed access to information that may come from Russia, and indeed that can be a source of worry. And this is again why I would not just trust Mr. Assange 100% for what he's doing. I mean, there are also powerful forces that may use him as a conduit to achieve political objectives. And it's obvious that neither Putin nor Trump want the EU project to be successful. And it's no surprise to me, of course, that the likes of Mr. Farage are lining up with those guys.
Before we let you go, Mr. Lambert, we've got some big elections coming up. The Netherlands next week, we've got France, we've got right here in Germany.
Yes.
Is Europe strong enough? Are the democracies strong enough to withstand any type of meddling, possible Russian attempts to manipulate the elections?
Well, I really trust the intelligence of our citizens, and trust is the basics of democracy. And if we, as politicians, start questioning or losing trust in our citizens, then actually we are undermining democracy. So we should feel confident enough to face off such threats. And even in the US, even if there was, and there has been meddling by Russia in the US election, at the end of the day, it's the US voters who made the decision. And, well, they made up their minds based on the information they had. And actually, they knew enough, I think, about Clinton and about Trump to make their choice. By the way, I know no other country in the world where the loser of the popular vote is the winner of the election. That, well, puts the US democracy a bit in question.
All right, some very clear words there. Philippe Lamberts, the co-leader of the Green Party in the European Parliament. Mr. Lambert, thank you very much for joining us tonight from Brussels.
My pleasure. Have a good night. Bye.